This is a quick public service announcement that you need to stop marking distracting, annoying things in your music. I'm going to explain what defines something as distracting and annoying and give you some tips to actually mark your music in an effective way. My name is Josh Gu, and I'm taking my years of experience learning, teaching, and performing and sharing all of my best clarinet and music tips so you can get more out of your practice and, most importantly, have fun. You can learn more about all of my many resources at quickstartclarinet.com, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell to get notified when I post new videos. So the inspiration for this video comes from a municipal band that I've been playing in over the summer. And the way that the municipal band works where I'm at is that we do one rehearsal on Thursdays and then the concert on Sunday. We have a concert every week, a rehearsal every week, and it's different music. So it's about an hour of music, one rehearsal, one concert, new music the next week. Now, in an ideal world, we would all have a lot of time and be able to really diligently practice all our parts and all that good stuff. But it's just really not realistic when you have a whole concert of music every week. So some portions of it, at the rehearsal at least, are going to be sight reading. And that's okay because some of it is sight readable. However, when there's distracting markings like this and like this that don't really make sense or even are misleading, then it really slows down that process and forces mistakes when there didn't actually need to be mistakes there because it wasn't anything complicated. So I wanted to go through and sort of explain kind of bad ways of marking things and show you some better ways of doing it. And as we go through the video and you see the examples, you'll kind of see a general tendency that the bad ways are distracting and cluttering the page, whereas the better ways are clear and specific and gives you actually something concrete to follow. So to get started, I actually want to just talk generally about marking music and when it's appropriate to mark music and when it's not. First of all, always, always, always be using pencil. I think that's pretty common sense. Hopefully you've had band teachers tell you that time and time and time again. I know I certainly did growing up, but always use pencil so that your marks can be erased. Now, if you're playing off an original part, meaning it's not already photocopied, then be really diligent and really careful about how you're marking it. It's absolutely okay to mark originals with pencil, but we want to make sure that you're marking it in ways that make sense because more likely than not, eventually that original part is going to get photocopied and shared with a future student or a future ensemble member in that group. And if you mark it really sloppily and messily, then all of those future people who read off of that version are going to have to look at that. And even if it is an original, they're going to have to look at it. Luckily, if they're looking at the original and it's written in pencil, they can erase what they don't like. But if it's a photocopy, then it can't be erased anymore. So be really careful if you're marking originals. Along those same lines, sometimes you'll get rental parts, and rental parts can be very, very strict about having everything erased and having no markings when it gets returned to whoever it's being rented from. So if your conductor says that these are rental parts and says something about things needing to be erased, then lightly mark things in pencil. Try not to mark too much and make sure that you erase it very diligently and carefully. All right, now getting into some more specific issues that we see. I'm going to sort of break these into categories, but I'm going to start with a general one that I wasn't sure what category to put it in. So we see music like this, and sometimes we'll see markings like maybe, for example, this, where just a note is circled. And the reason why this is a terrible marking is the same reason why I couldn't put it into a category, because I have no idea what that means. If I'm reading through a piece of music and I just see a note circled, I don't know why it was circled. Was it a note that they were missing? Is it an important note? Should it have an accidental on it? Is it a note from the key signature? I have no idea why it's circled. And an example from my municipal band music, there's this passage with a circled note, and it's not an accidental. Most of the time circled notes are an accidental, but I have no idea why that note is circled. And every time I got to it, as I was playing through it, I was thinking, huh, I wonder why that note's circled, which is distracting me from actually playing. And also when I see it circled coming up, I think, oh, maybe it should have an accidental on it or something like that. So this one that I just circled maybe is circled because of the F sharp, so maybe that's it, but I don't know because it's only circled. So that's probably the worst marking that you could make in a piece of music, is to just circle something. Another thing that I find sometimes gets circled is just tricky passages. We'll circle like, oh, this little bit I'm struggling with, as kind of a reminder to practice it later. That's a little bit more okay because you'll go back and practice it and then hopefully erase that marking. But an even better one, if you need a reminder to practice something, is I like to just make a small little star next to that section to remember to come back to it. It's so much easier to erase the little star. It's not going to take up a bunch of music. And that sort of big circle marking kind of sticks out as a red flag of like, oh, this is really challenging, is a problem, and sort of helps you get stuck that way as well. Whereas just the little star, you don't notice as much. Even after you erase it, sometimes you kind of still see the indentation of where that big circle mark was. So the little star is much better, I think, for marking those kinds of passages. Now, going into some sort of specific things that I think I see get marked wrong a lot, I'm going to start with key signatures and accidentals. So with accidentals, we can see, again from the example from the beginning, this looks like a very clear E sharp. But in fact, it's not an E sharp. It's actually supposed to be an F sharp on the previous note. But because that marking is so big, and there are so many big markings like that, it's impossible to tell where it's at. So looking at measure 11 in this example here again, if we want to mark that F sharp on the and of 3, instead of doing like, okay, that's sharp, or is the B sharp, or is the F sharp, or maybe the A is supposed to be sharp. I don't know what that sharp is relating to. We want to make it as clear and precise as possible. It's absolutely okay to mark accidentals, and even if you're working with originals, it's okay to not erase accidentals, actually. I think sometimes that's kind of friendly and helpful for the next person, as long as you make them look as close to printed accidentals as possible. So even in this situation, there's not quite enough room to like really get it in there. You can maybe pull that off, but then it gets kind of clear and kind of blobby and almost looks like there's an extra note in there. So that might not work here, but just do just a really nice little sharp right above the note so that you can really clearly see, okay, that's the note that's supposed to be sharp. And again, if you can get it in front of the note, even better, so it looks as close to a printed accidental as possible when marking accidentals. The other big thing to be careful of when marking accidentals is please don't go through and mark every accidental in the key signature. So like when we get to 27, if we start going, okay, G sharp, F sharp, C sharp, and just marking every single accidental. Because again, it gets really intimidating to read that. And now I know that we're playing in the key of A major and we have the 3 sharps in the key signature, but then if I see a bunch more sharps marked, I'm going to be thinking, oh my gosh, there's all these crazy accidentals happening, and it's going to become really cluttered, really confusing. So don't mark too many accidentals. Just mark the ones like in measure 11 where it's carrying through. It was an F sharp at the beginning of the measure, but is way further along in the measure at the end of the measure after I've played a bunch of notes. It's easy to forget. So leaving that accidental in, even on an original part, if it's written in nicely, I think is totally appropriate. Now let's talk about key signatures. So we get that key change at 27 to A major, and something that I'll see a lot that again kind of drives me bonkers is people will like do a big circle on that one and a big circle on that one and just circle the key signatures really kind of obnoxiously. And the problem with this is that it gets really confusing again. So I'm playing to the end of the line, I'm like, whoa, big circle coming up. I don't know what that's about. And then we get another big circle on the beginning, and at least I do know that it's circling the key signature to draw attention to it, so that's okay. Occasionally, if there's a key signature change in the middle of a line, then I'll circle it. But we should be used to looking at the beginning of the line and glancing back there to know what the key signature is. And again, the only time I would need to draw attention to it is if it's sort of in the middle of the line. So I would be used to glancing to the beginning of the line, but that might not be the right one. So I need that circle to say, hey, pay attention here. This is actually the key that we're currently in. So don't do big circles for key signatures and key changes. I do find sometimes I miss key changes, but the much better thing to do is mark the first one or maybe two notes that are related to that key change as they come up. So I might mark this G sharp. And it's not because I need a reminder that it's sharp from earlier in the measure. It's reminding me that the key has changed, and that's why I need that sharp there. So that's a much more effective way to mark key signatures instead of circling them and drawing unnecessary attention to them. Just put in the first accidental of the new key or something like that, and that will cue your brain to be like, oh yeah, we're actually in a different key now. That's why that accidental is there. So that's a much more effective way to do key signatures and accidentals that won't get in the way. So for our next category of things and markings, let's look at rhythm and counting. So looking here at measure 35, there's a very common thing that somebody might mark in here because of the way the notes are syncopated and the rhythm is written. And they might do like a big slash here to show that that's where beat 2 is. The problem with that big slash is sometimes that's also used to indicate that that note should be clipped or sort of separated. And it looks like a big separation because of that big slash. I'm a big fan of knowing where the beats are. I'm a big fan of knowing where the beats are and marking them and kind of having that beat 1's there, beat 2's there, beat 3 is there kind of idea. But if we mark them as huge slashes like this, again, it's cluttering and it's distracting and it's hard to know what's going on. So instead of marking those big slashes that are ambiguous, confusing, distracting, what I like to mark is the actual counting. So the important note that I need to get is not holding the quarter note through beat 2. It's that I need to know that the next note comes on the and of 2. So the way I would mark that is by writing an and above the F sharp on the and of 2. And then if I really needed to be clear about where that was, I could either mark a 2 before it and maybe a little slash to show like that's where 2 is, or even better, mark a 3 after it, again with sort of a little slash pointing to where it's going, so that I know that is the and leading to beat 3, or it's the and of 2. And again, you can see this marking is clear, precise, understandable, even sight reading through, I can catch that. Once I learn it, I won't be distracted by it being there. These kinds of markings, if you're working off an original, I would probably erase because everybody has kind of their own nuanced way that they like to write rhythm stuff. So your way of writing it might be confusing to other people in the future. But make it really clear, make it really precise. Don't be doing big slashes all over the place to show where things are. If there's something where you do need more slashes to show where the beat is and you don't feel like writing in all of the letters, because that can be really obnoxious as well. Something that might happen like that is maybe looking at measure 25, somebody might write like 1, 2, 3, E, and to know that that happens on the of 3, and that's how long it's sustained for. But that's just so cumbersome and there's so much stuff happening there. So instead of putting in all of the numbers, sometimes slashes are okay and beneficial, but mark them very clearly just above 1, 2, 3. Okay, I know that I hold that for 3 counts and then play the pickup to 1. Another place where that might be kind of necessary is on some faster notes. So if we look here at the bottom of the page here at measure 42, or actually I'm going to do 44 because that's easier to see, we have these 16th note triplets, and those are on the and of 1, but it might be confusing, and again, writing something like and triplet gets really cumbersome to see all of that action going on. But what we need to know is that's beat 1, that's the and of 1, that's beat 2. So you can do those little slashes above the music, make the ands a smaller slash, make the beats a bigger slash. So again, we have that clarity, precision, it's easy to see, and easy to understand. Now the next category, just very short and sweet, is articulation and releases and things like that. So what we'll often see in music is kind of some weird ambiguous markings with like staccatos or releases. Say we're looking at measure 22. We have the breath mark there, so we know that there should be a release of that note, a breath, and then a continuation. But sometimes people will put things like slashes. And again, is that a slash showing where the beat is? Or is it a slash showing that there should be space there and that note should sort of end and release and go on to the next thing? A much better thing to write for clarifying those releases is something like -3. So that's showing that we release on 3. 1, 2, release, and 1. So those kinds of releases are really helpful. Same thing with 12. We might want a really full valued quarter note there. So we want to go all the way to beat 2. So we show 2, 2. Sustain to 2, release on 2. Or maybe we don't want a super long sustain there and we want that note to actually just be a very clear ending note, and we might do a -1 to show sustain it until 1. 3E and a 1, just very, very quick. Another way to do that as well, instead of doing a slash to show that it should be clipped or something like that, just put a dot on it and use articulation the way it's written. So if we want a clear sort of crisp clipped note on that downbeat, put a staccato there to show that it should be short and separated and kind of have that ending to it. As a general rule, as I'm going through this, I'm noticing just try to mark the music the way that it would be notated and engraved so that you're reading the instructions like you would normally read instructions, and just really don't get too fancy with it. And I think that's a great general rule for all the articulation markings, is just write it the way that it should be notated, and that will clear up any confusion. Now the next category of markings are kind of fun. These are the pay attention markings. So that might be circling something. So maybe we have some dynamics that we're paying attention to. So maybe this crescendo, for example, maybe we'll end up circling the crescendo to pay attention to it. Or maybe we'll do something like eyeglasses. I've never really done this, so I don't really know how to draw them, but we get those sort of eyeglasses markings there in measure 40 for at the rallentando. That says kind of pay attention, look at the conductor, those kinds of things. And we also might have this with certain intervals that are particularly tricky. So if we're playing something that's roughly scale-like and then it suddenly becomes not a scale, so maybe here in measure 21, maybe we circle that E to say, oh, this interval is going to be weird, or maybe even we circle both of the notes to say, like, pay attention there and get that jump correctly. All of those markings I think are terrible. The reason why, again, like we talked about, circling is just kind of generic circling. Circling the crescendo is obvious that you're trying to draw attention to the crescendo, but the problem with that is that it's this big distracting circle. I'm trying to play the notes and then I see this big circle and totally get distracted and thrown off. Some other people in the future playing off of this part, maybe they don't even need the crescendo circled because they can see that there's a crescendo there and don't need attention drawn to it. So those kinds of just circling dynamics is not the best usually. Occasionally, if I'm like really needing to remember to play piano or something and get the dynamic change, maybe I'll circle it as like a, hey, remember to actually play the piano, maybe. An even better way to do that with dynamics, to remember to play piano, is have piano, and then next to it, I'll put like flute or something, or whatever instrument that has the melody, and as a reminder to blend with their dynamics, be under their dynamics because they have the melody, and I'm kind of balancing my piano in contrast or in relationship to what that instrument is doing, which is such a more meaningful marking than just, oh, don't forget to play piano, and make sure that you get that. With the crescendo, sometimes we miss crescendos and diminuendos because they're just kind of hard to see with where we're looking at. So if you want to really make it clear, maybe I'm more looking above the music, so then I'll draw the crescendo above the music where it's easier to see. This example is not a great example for that because it is also going down, so those notes are down there, so it's really easy to see the crescendo down there. But actually at measure 34 might be a better one, where we have that diminuendo there, but because the notes are above the staff, I'm not going to be looking all the way below the staff to get that dynamic change, so I'll write in the diminuendo above so I can see. And again, it's crystal clear what this means. It's not anything ambiguous to it. Looking at 21 for the paying attention to the interval, the circle's kind of okay, but then again, I have no idea why that's circled if I'm somebody else reading that. What I like to do for that is a little caret or a little triangle. So I would do this kind of a mark. This one I think is probably my worst mark, and if you have a better idea for this, definitely let me know in the comments. But the way I interpret this mark is pay attention to that interval, pay attention going from this note to this note so that you actually get it and notice that it's not the same pattern that's been going. The problem with this is it does kind of look like a vertical accent or a marcato mark, so that can be a little bit ambiguous and misinterpreted, and most of the time I would try to erase those off of my part where I put them. Another one that I sometimes see too to kind of draw attention to a note is a tenuto, to say like, hey, pay attention to that note, anchor onto that note, lean onto that note. But again, that has problems because is it a mental anchoring onto that note, or should I actually do some kind of tenuto articulation to it? So that can be tricky as well. So if you have a pay attention to this interval, anchor into this note kind of marking that is really clear, definitely let me know in the comments. Then the last one for this kind of pay attention is the conductor glasses, like down here at measure 40. This marking is kind of okay because when there is a tempo change, it is good to look at the conductor and see how much of a tempo change is happening. But I don't love that marking because it doesn't give me any more information than that other than, okay, look up and pay attention, but I don't know what I'm looking for. So for rallentandos and all tempo changes, whether it's a cello or a rall, I like to do an arrow showing which way. So a rallentando is a backwards arrow and a cello would be a forwards arrow. And I do the arrow over the whole duration of it because this isn't just rallentando for just these two notes. It's all the way until the fermata. And again, it depends on the piece for how long that'll be, but for this one it goes to the fermata and I need to be paying attention to the conductor and connecting with them over that whole duration. All right, the final category of markings are things that are sort of musical interpretation decisions that either you or the conductor are putting in. So one of those might be dynamics that aren't written. So if we're looking at measure 16, 17, and 18, we have kind of this sequence of be-da-da-da-dum, ba-dee-da-da-da-dum, ba-dee-da-da-da-dum, and that sort of same pattern repeating but descending each time. So a common musical practice to do that would be to maybe diminuendo across those and maybe even do kind of terraced dynamics. So maybe it's mezzo forte, mezzo piano, and then piano, something like that. Marking it in that way would be perfectly appropriate because it's very clear. It's marking just like the notation would be marking it, so you know exactly what's going on. Another form of musical interpretation that the composer might decide to put in are some fermatas and caesuras and things like that. So maybe in 26, the conductor adds a fermata to that note, and then we have kind of a grand pause, railroad tracks, caesura on the rest before we go on to the next thing. These kinds of markings, both the dynamics that get added in and the breaths and pauses and breaks and things like that with the fermata and the caesura, those I think are okay to leave in and not erase because they can be really helpful to future players. The dynamics are kind of just musical things that probably most people would do kind of naturally and intuitively, but having them written there is just a great reminder to do musical dynamics, and I don't think they're too distracting and aren't going to get in the way too much. The fermata and the caesura and things like that are really helpful to future players because it tells them to pay attention. There's nothing worse than blowing through a fermata when the whole rest of the group does it, so putting it there so that people are aware and have that heads up is really nice. Now, we might not hold that fermata, so whenever you're playing a piece and you see a handwritten in fermata or a handwritten caesura, don't take it as purely for sure gonna happen. Take it with a little bit of a grain of salt and just know, okay, there could be a fermata here. I need to pay attention and might hold that note, check out what the conductor is doing. But it's so much better to have it and not actually do it than to not have it and not do it when the whole rest of the group does it. So those kinds of markings I think are actually really valuable to leave in and kind of leave as a gift for the future players. And the same thing goes for any added in tempo changes as well. So if the conductor was going to do that fermata there, then they might also do a little bit of writ getting into it, so drawing a little backwards arrow. And again, if there's not a writ written in, then it might be even better to handwrite in the writ just so it's very crystal clear that that's what's going to be happening there for any future players. All right, I hope that that gives you some ideas and helpful sort of tips and tricks and hints for how to mark your parts effectively. Now you can be as annoyed as I am when you see terribly marked parts in whatever groups you're playing in. It's inevitable that you'll come across them. And it's okay, we can read around it and learn the music and get used to it. But hopefully you won't be the one making those annoying and distracting and cluttering marks anymore, because now you know the correct way to do it. And if there's any marks that I missed, leave them in the comments. If you have questions about how I mark anything, leave them in the comments. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in another one. And last but not least, a huge heartfelt thank you to the Dennersons. This is like the Quick Start Clarinet family who supports the channel and helps to make everything that I do possible. If you would like to support the channel and get some awesome rewards in return where we can work one-on-one over video and you can have my full support moving forward on your clarinet journey, then go to quickstartclarinet.com/supporter.